Hi, everyone. I'm Rich Green, and I'm a senior advisor to Route 50. Along with my wife, Catherine Barrett, I also write columns for the publication. And we're also gratified to be heads of the Route 50 Advisory Board. I'm glad to be here on the first day of Future Cities to be exploring one of the most important topics for the future of cities, the changing tax and revenue landscape. As the Government Finance Officers Association wrote, and I'll read this because I don't want to misquote anybody, local government revenues have not remained aligned with modern economic realities. And anyone who works in or near a city government knows how true that is. Among the other issues, the changing economy has challenged the capacity of localities to rely overwhelmingly, as they always have, on property taxes. Remote work, for example, has taken people from where they used to be, which were taxable office spaces, to their homes. And suddenly the tax structure alters and people need to do something. The cities need to do something about that. So the question of the day is, how are cities reassessing their revenue streams and identifying new and innovative sources to take into account the changes in the fiscal environment? I'm joined this afternoon by two public sector leaders who are going to help us answer these questions based on their work in their own communities. But both of them, I've had the opportunity to chat with both of them, and they're both very smart and very eloquent people who have a good idea of what's happening, not just in their own communities, but also nationwide. So the conversation may go a little bit more broadly than just the two communities, though they're both very interesting. And we have with us today Jose Cisneros, who is the treasurer for the city and county, very important, the city and county of San Francisco, and Cayenne Camus, who's executive director of Partner Tulsa. Jose, Cayenne, thank you for being here today. And I'd like to start with something, the easiest question I'll ask all day, which is, Cayenne, could you tell us, I think everybody knows what San Francisco is. I mean, and if they don't, they're not watching this. Cayenne, could you tell us just a little bit about Partner Tulsa so that people will know the perspective that you bring to our conversation?
Yeah, so Partner Tulsa is essentially the operating name of the Tulsa Authority for Economic Opportunity. We are a public trust located in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the second largest city in the state of Oklahoma. And we were created really out of the effective merger of 5 different public entities: our Industrial Authority, our Parking Authority, our Development Authority, which is our Urban Renewal Authority, the Economic Development Commission, and the Mayor's Office of Economic Development. So we are a quasi-public entity. We were created specifically with the goal of consolidating and merging the city's economic and community development functions and some of its largest economic and community development assets, with the goal of creating a sustainable organization that has strong revenues that could fund these efforts.
Great, that's just perfect. And now I'm hoping we'll have some conversation, but I'm going to just kick things off with a question. This is maybe the big question. As property values have gone up, particularly in tough fiscal times when property values may be going up, but people's incomes may not necessarily be, though people tend to be employed, which is a good thing. Local taxpayers, including and very notably small businesses, can have real difficulties in paying their taxes. I know that both of your cities have taken steps to avoid driving people or businesses out of town. Would you share your experiences with that a little bit? Jose, do you want to kick things off there?
Sure, Richard. Thanks for asking. I'm glad to be here. Jose Cisneros, San Francisco Treasurer. We are both a city and a county. Thank you for noting that, Richard. It makes us a little bit of a different from other cities and other counties. But property taxes, as you well point out, are a major driver of revenues, I think, for pretty much every local government. In San Francisco, property taxes are the largest tax or fee revenue of all the 100 plus taxes and fees that bring revenue into the city. You talked about how property taxes and based on property values continue to go up and up, and they certainly do in San Francisco. I think for as long as anybody can remember, the supply and demand formula for San Francisco has been very skewed towards more people wanting to live here than there's space for them and their businesses to occupy. Of course, that means that property values go up and up and up, which unfortunately only drives our wealth gap even wider and wider and wider, because the people and the businesses that can afford to be here are the ones with the most amount of money. Your question was about what are we doing to try and respond to that and do what we can to help small businesses. For the longest, as long as I can remember, when we put taxes on businesses, which is something that our local taxes are primarily, almost entirely levied on businesses, we don't have any personal income taxes or anything like that in terms of local revenue generation. When we put our taxes on businesses, we do, at least where possible, we go out of our way to try and alleviate the burden on the smallest businesses. For example, our San Francisco business tax, which is a tax that was most recently, and the most recent change to it was a conversion from a tax based on a company's payroll to a tax being based on a business's gross receipts. When that was passed by the voters nearly 10 years ago, that tax included an exemption for all businesses with gross receipts of under $2 million each year. So again, right there is an example of where we're trying to say for our smallest, for our fledgling, for our startup businesses, we don't want to add our business tax as yet another burden that might slow them down or make their numbers impossible to manage. So we try and do that. The other example I would put out there is that during the pandemic, we really wanted to work hard to alleviate the burdens of the pandemic was creating. Certainly many, if not most, if not nearly all of the businesses in the city had to shut down in one way or another. And many of them saw their revenues drop considerably, if not disappear entirely. And what we, the city and county, did was we worked with our policymakers and we actually pushed our deadlines out for a significant period of time. While taxes might still be due, we made them due, a half a year or even a year later than they would normally have been. So the businesses would have a chance to get up on their feet and be able to respond and make payments again. And for some of the very smallest businesses, some taxes or fees were eliminated entirely during the pandemic.
That's great stuff. Now, everybody, I think, knows pretty much about the boom in San Francisco. I'm not so sure people understand what a boom city Tulsa is. So, Kyan, I know you're confronting the same kind of issues. How are you folks addressing it?
Yeah, so I would say our team deals a lot with, we don't have direct taxation power or really have control over tax rates in Tulsa, or the ability to kind of, modify or delay, but we do have the ability to really think through and strategically develop tools that can help mitigate the impacts of taxation in Tulsa. So I would say we think about this in a couple of ways. Over the past several years, our team has been really thinking about, historically, the city did a really great job of thinking about how do we attract and help grow really big businesses. That could be large employers or larger retailers. We had a lot of tools on that front to help them deal with rising cost or the cost of investing in Tulsa. But we weren't so great about thinking about how do we help small and mid-sized businesses. So we've really done a lot of thinking about, how do we develop loan programs? How do we develop grant programs that can address the needs of those businesses? But then I would say we are doing a lot of thinking too about how do we, particularly because we do a lot of work in the development space, how do we look at using new tools like community land trusts that are really meant to try to mitigate some of the pressures that you start to see in real estate, particularly as you experience rapid growth and development. That's kind of a new frontier for us. We own about just over 50 acres of land just north of downtown. It's largely in the historic Greenwood district, a very important part of the city to Tulsa. And as we think about how does Greenwood grow and how do we make sure that it grows in an inclusive manner that doesn't displace existing residents, that welcomes Black businesses and entrepreneurs and homeowners back into that neighborhood, we're really thinking through what are the tools that we have to put in place that really mitigate these pressures. But then we're also thinking through, how do we use tools like tax increment finance that capture some of the growth that we see in ad valorem taxes, and then return that back to things like affordable housing. And that's really where we see the benefit of having this opportunity to both kind of control our assets and think about how we use our assets to mitigate outcomes, but then how do we also utilize our relationships with private developers to generate and drive outcomes that we know our residents expect.
That's great. One of the purposes of these Route 50 sessions is to give other communities opportunities to learn from our speakers. So tell me just a little bit more. What is a community land trust? How does it work? And is this something other cities can be doing?
Yeah, so a community land trust essentially takes, could be raw ground, it could be an asset, and moves it into a trust structure that really controls how, if you make a sale of that asset, what happens with the sale price or the proceeds of that, with the goal of ultimately ensuring that the benefits of land transactions are returned back into the community. In some cases, you have a community land trust that will own the underlying ground and then will allow for development to occur on top of that ground. And then as an asset is sold, it's just essentially the surface development that is being sold. It gives you a long-term tool to control outcomes. I will say in the case, oftentimes historically, when we've done development, we sell the parcel outright, and you can have a contract for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years that says what happens within the context of that time frame for that development. But if you come to the end of that contract, it's really beyond that you lose the opportunity to control, whether or not there's affordability included, if it's a housing development. So really, a community land trust gives you a long-term way to control the outcomes and the uses and the community benefit of a project. That's probably it. That's a really rough description of what a CLT can do, but yeah.
If we had more time, I'd ask you for more extrapolation. But a rough answer is, yeah. The perfect, as they say, is the enemy of the good. So you used Cayenne. But I'm going to use that word and then pose the question initially to Jose. Use the word strategic a couple of times in your comments, and I think it's probably an important thing all cities have strategies. But it's the reevaluation of the strategies, not making a strategy in 2020 or 2018 and anticipating that strategy is going to be the most effective one in 5 years or 10 years hence. So Jose, how important? I guess it's two questions. How important do you think it is to take a regular look at the strategies you're developing to collect revenues, and how does San Francisco actually do that?
That's a great question, Richard. And you're exactly right. It's critically important to stay on top of how the structures, particularly the tax and revenue structures that we and the voters have put in place, how they are behaving and how productive, let's say, they're being in terms of capturing the correct amount of revenue, not overburdening any one sector or another, but also just generating enough revenue so that the city and county or the local government can do the things it needs to do. And folks are looking to their local governments to provide more and more and more services all the time. And of course, the dynamics of what our community needs and wants continue to evolve and change over time. In our city and county government, we have a number of different departments that are always kind of measuring, engaging, and evaluating how the financial picture is playing out. Like everyone else, we set a budget once a year, each year. And I like to explain to people that unlike the federal government or even many, if not all state governments, local governments don't have the ability to borrow. So we cannot, get any other, we cannot build a budget with any other revenues other than what we are actually planning on bringing in actually and monetarily during that budget year. So we do our best to, of course, do what our reality is, which is live within our means and we can only spend what we can expect to receive. And that is a very fine line to walk, to be perfectly honest. And what we have in our case, in our city, and I'm sure this function exists in every city, no matter what department it lives in, our controller's office is every quarter throughout every budget year measuring how we're performing compared to how we expected revenues and expenditures to balance out. And it puts out a report every 3 and 6 months. And certainly by mid-year, if anything is looking really different than it was expected to be, adjustments are beginning to be made. And departments get told things like, you have to incorporate, reduction in spending for the remaining 6 months, so on and so forth. We're constantly balancing, measuring, and responding to how it looks like things are performing throughout the 12-month year.
So volatility, right? I mean, that's the tricky part. I'd like both of you to kind of respond to this. Everybody understands that things are cyclic. Maybe people, actually, I take that back. Many people don't understand that things are cyclic. And that's a lot how cities get into deep trouble, is that times are good. They're always going to be good. And so we cut taxes and we raise services and we run into trouble 3 years down the line. So I take back the notion that everybody knows things are cyclic, but they are. And I guess the question is, how do you deal with volatile revenues? Both Tulsa and San Francisco confront that. And Jose, you want to start, and then Cayenne, over to you.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, that's another great point. And I'll tell you, it is a very, very important issue to deal with. And in fact, it can, as you point out, become a problem very, very quickly. The reality is that when revenues come into local governments, I believe all the leaders of local governments and the members of the community want the government to spend those funds quickly and on everything that they find important in their community. But what I appreciate our government leaders did, and this was 10 plus years ago, was they went to the voters and said, we need to build up reserves. Because when we went through the Great Recession in 08, 09, it was devastating. Year after year after year, as the revenue did not meet what expectations were, our city issued orders to all of our departments. You have to cut your budget. You have to cut your budget year after year after year after year, which meant that services to the community were being eliminated or reduced. And so what wisely the leaders at that time, again, went to the voters and said, we really need to build up the city county's reserves. And the voters actually passed, and we now have, I think it's 3 different reserve funds that are tailored in a way that whenever there is revenue that might meet or exceed targets, any excess goes into the reserve. And to this point now, there's hundreds of millions of dollars waiting in those reserves for, certainly, we know will come someday, the next recession, the next dip in the economy, the next change, as you talk about, that was unexpected. It says we're not going to receive the revenues we hoped for, but we don't want to cut vital city services.
Cayenne, before I turn over to you, I just want to follow up on that for a second. Mm-hmm. I know this is particularly true at the state level, Jose, that when states develop what you were just describing, typically often called rainy day funds, there's often a little bit of pushback on the part of the citizenry saying, if you can put all this money aside, why don't you just cut our taxes? How do you deal with that?
Those conversations certainly exist. And the truth of the matter is, what I think is important, and this is largely the case in California, is many of the things like handling money, creating taxes, things like that, require a vote of the voters. And so I think the real truth of the matter is, particularly here in San Francisco, that I think the government leaders and the community have both done a good job of listening to the logic, listening to the thought process, and actually voting. Going to the polls and voting, let's create those reserves. And when the voters have created them, I think it's a lot harder for the population later on to say, oh no, we should change that, we should do away with that, we should alter that. Because again, it was something that not just an elected politician or one or another said, the voters put it in place.
Great, that's a wonderful answer. Most states don't do it that way, and they run into the problems I was just describing. And obviously, you're not a state. Cayenne, back over to you, and it's sort of the same question as I started out with Jose. What about volatility? How does Tulsa deal with this inevitable conundrum?
Yeah, so we actually, I mean, part of the reason that we created the Tulsa Authority for Economic Opportunity, Partner Tulsa, was out of recognition that we needed to find a way to fund our economic and community development efforts in a way that didn't rely so much on the oftentimes very volatile general revenue fund. So that as we looked across the landscape of the organizations that were doing economic and community development and saw that we had pockets of assets that had great revenue generating potential. We were wasting a lot of money based upon administration inefficiencies. We thought combining them could really help us save some money, but also create this entity that had the ability to kind of self-fund and pull away from a complete reliance upon general fund revenues in Tulsa. The converse of that is that a good portion of our budget and our asset base is parking assets. We own a number of structured parking garages in downtown Tulsa. As you can imagine, COVID-19, if you have a heavy base of both event parkers and office workers, COVID-19 hits, and we had a pretty substantial disruption in the revenue stream within our parking system. While it's not fun launching an organization in the midst of a big crisis like COVID-19, it at least made us very aware of the fact of how volatile those revenue streams were. It would have been much worse to launch, in the year prior to COVID-19 with an expectation that those revenues were stable and then have to make massive cuts once they dipped. And our response, again, recognizing the fact that we have this revenue volatility within the structure of our kind of operating world, is to really think through how do we, as we think about our long-term strategy when it comes to our asset base, how might we invest in assets that are a little bit more stable? We own parking assets, which do have that kind of volatile component, but we also own a number of industrial assets that are leased to private employers. Those leases are long-term leases and the revenue streams are quite stable. So I think as we think about, we're sitting on about an $11 million fund balance, as we think about what our strategies are long-term and how we deploy that fund balance or how we make investments, the board and our team is really thinking through how might we acquire or develop new assets that can counterbalance the potentially cyclical nature of our parking revenues. The other thing I would say that we've thought a lot about is just, we evaluated our parking rate and fee structure, which hadn't been raised in over a decade. It was dramatically below market rate. So we were missing out on revenue opportunities in an era when we saw costs increasing, both staffing costs to operate the garages, the cost of capital repairs and improvements. So we went and we did an increase in our parking rates and fees, still below what the market is, but getting much more closer to where it should be. That's something we expect that we'll do on a regular basis so that we can keep up with the inflationary pressures of those operating costs. And then we're really trying to evaluate, because again, we do so much work with external private entities where we're providing a very valuable service and oftentimes providing access to these public incentives. We're trying to make sure that we have structures in place that allow us to recover our cost of those partnerships. So really being deliberate and thinking about where are we just missing out on revenue opportunities that previously weren't being captured.
That's fascinating. I think Tulsa's work with parking has been really a model for other places. You've done amazing things, but it turns me to a sort of a broad question. When we talked about up till just this moment, when we were talking about revenues, we were mostly talking about a little bit about income taxes for places that are allowed to collect them, and a lot about property taxes. But fines and fees are a big deal. And they're a problematic big deal. A lot of localities are turning to them. Some, I think, to maybe too great an extent, and maybe they become the equivalent of sort of a regressive kind of an income tax. One might think of it as. Jose, do you want to take that? Because I know you've been very concerned about fines and fees in San Francisco, and making sure that they're I guess the word is fair.
Yeah, Richard, that's exactly right. We've done a lot of work at looking at our fines and fees in San Francisco. And one of the things we looked at, we noticed very quickly was something that was really true and particularly prominent when you looked at fines. Fines are a result of breaking a rule or a law of some sort. So you have a fine. One fine, and unfortunately, because we're a very high cost of living city, our fines are pretty expensive, pretty large. The issue we quickly discovered was when we looked at this more closely was that when the fine is $1 amount for everybody, no surprise that dollar amount fine is going to impact a low income family or individual far differently from a middle income or certainly a high income family or individual. And for example, I'll just give you one pretty glaring and shocking example. In San Francisco, if you happen to park your car in the wrong place, we have to clear our streets and our parking lanes at rush hour so there's no gridlock. So once 3 o'clock hits, for example, on a certain street, if you're still parked on that street, you'll get towed. If you get your car towed in San Francisco, even if you go on the first day before there's any, storage fees piled up or anything like that, to retrieve your car on day one, if you got towed, is nearly $500. There's plenty of research that shows that low income families, close to half or more of the families in this country that are low income, don't have access to $500 on any given notice. So what happens to those families? They lose their car. If a family loses their car, does that mean that a wage earner can't go to work? If that wage earner can't go to work, does that mean they might lose their job? If he or she loses their job and their income, does that mean they can't pay their rent and maybe you'll be evicted? Is there anyone that believes that parking in the wrong place at the wrong time should, through a series of events, result in a family losing their home and becoming homeless? Of course not. And so that's just the most glaring example of how an outsized impact exists on our poorest families, far different from medium or high income families who would view a $500 fine and retrieval fee as perhaps a nuisance. So what we did was we found a way to right size our penalty amounts. And right now, when we first took that $500 fee and cut it by half, we found that even that wasn't enough to really accommodate the low income folks. So now that amount has reduced to $100 for our lowest income individuals. Now, of course, there always needs to be a consequence for breaking a rule. But I think in my mind, the idea is let's right size that penalty so we make sure that there's a consequence, but there's not an undue impact. The other reality example I want to share is fees. We have a lot of fees that are meant to recoup monies that the city spent to provide services. Sometimes that makes sense, but other times it really didn't. The most glaring example I have there is we had folks who'd done their time coming out of prison. They came back to our community. We wanted them to see them put their lives back together. But we had the genius idea that everybody has, which is we charge them a fee for being on probation because that's a normal consequence of coming out of prison. Our fee was $60 a month. We billed for 3 years in advance, and we sent every person returning to our community from prison a bill for $1,800. No surprise, nearly all those bills went unpaid. So it wasn't really gathering any revenue for our city, but it was putting a lot of delinquent and unpaid debt on their credit reports. We saw that not only was that not helping us, it was harming them. It was blocking them from getting access to good jobs. It was blocking them from getting access to a place to live. And that was the last thing we wanted to do. So we worked with our local courts that were our partner in this effort. We eliminated all those fees and we erased all that debt from their records. Folks saw their credit scores jump up by dozens of points overnight. And that's what we wanted to do. We want to bring logic to our fines and fees and make it better.
That's terrific work and very, very impressive. Our time is about to come to a close, so I'm going to sort of give you an impossible to answer question, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. In 30 seconds or 45 seconds, we can go 30 seconds over. In 45 seconds or so, would each of you tell me your proudest accomplishment, not necessarily your personal proudest accomplishment, but the proudest accomplishment for your respective cities with regard to revenues? And Jose, as long as you were just speaking, I'll let you keep going. We'll go to Cayenne and then we'll say toodaloo for the day.
Thanks, Richard. I just want to say I'm really proud of the way that the City and County of San Francisco has taken a look at our revenues, our economy, and our budget to be responsive as we can be to both the needs of the community, but also the realities of the community. We've got to be mindful of the needs of our small businesses, the needs of our low-income people. We cannot overburden them if we expect them to be present, to be powerful, and to thrive. And that's the important thing. We've got to balance our needs with the needs of the folks that we're dealing with. Great.
And Kyan?
Yeah, selfishly, I will say my proudest moment for the city is creating Partner Tulsa. When I was in the Mayor's Office of Economic Development, my annual budget was just under $1.3 million. My FY23 budget right now is $5.7 million for the Tulsa Authority for Economic Opportunity. That I think really shows you the immense potential of how if you can consolidate these things, not only can you access additional revenue, but you also create efficiency. So you're unlocking just an enormous amount of revenue that you can reinvest back into these efforts. So it's definitely a shining part in my career so far.
Well, congratulations to both of you for the great work you're doing. We've kind of reached our time. I want to thank both of you very much for your candid and lucid and interesting comments. I do think we've accomplished the goal, which is to give other representatives from other cities something to chew on and think about maybe adopting for themselves. There's a lot here that our audience can take back to their own offices, and that's the goal of this whole exercise. So for Route 50, thank you both again. I'm Rich Green. And stay tuned for a City Tech Spotlight. Thank you.